So he kind of ends this section, this chapter, and in fact the book, right, by suggesting how maybe how does theism make things any different, right? And so we should probably read at least kind of large sections of this, because this is kind of, kind of his concluding remarks here in terms of what he's really aiming at.
Yeah, it sums up the book, the chapter, and this section.
Yeah, he says, a person-dependent value and meaning raises a number of important questions for Christians and other theists. For one thing, can God provide our lives with meaning? Can God do that, right? He says yes, in the sense that we can value him and his values. And of course, many things can do that, right? Many things can provide us with meaning. We can value those and that sort of thing.
Atheists are true that you can pick your cat, your train, all these things with meaning. It's just whether or not it's good enough to get you.
Exactly. In other words, yeah. So he says, we can value communism, gardening, painting, whatever. There are lots of things. But so he says, so then is God just one choice among all of these various things that we can value, right? He says, well, on the one hand, God is different, right? That is literally God is holy or set apart. So God is different, right? According to Christians, he designed and created the universe and now continually keeps it in existence and running up to code. The universe and all its furniture, including us, are his, and he is the ultimate authority regardless of what we think of it. So, some of us interpret this authority as that of a loving father and others as that of a cruel dictator, right? So, here's the issue. Well, let's value something. Well, let's value God. Theists value God. Christians value God. Well, is he then... If we can value anything, is he's just a part of the list and we choose to do that? No, God is different. Clearly, God is different, right? The theistic God, the Christian God is different. He's the holy, set-apart creator, sustainer of the universe, and he has ultimate authority because he created it all, right?
Yeah, he's a different being than our being.
Yeah. Moreover, he says that God has designed us so that we function properly. Notice this. Only when we love the things that he loves and hate the things that he hates. So that's when we function properly. That's what it means to be created in the image of God. That's how God designed us, right? We are made to value the things he values. We flourish when our preferences align with his, right? So this includes our goals, purposes, and meaning in life. They should match his, at least insofar as we're able to as creatures. We're happiest when things go right in this way. And because this is, God's show, the things that he finds meaningful are as objective as things get, in that they're human independent, and that's the idea of objectivity, right? They're not just based on what we think or what we feel or our opinions or that sort of thing. They're independent of us, not person independent, right? Because value is he's been arguing all along. You have to have a person in order to a naked, barren universe doesn't have value. You have to have a person in order to have value, right? And so it's not person independent, but it's human independent, right? He says there are, in a very real sense, eternal values because God is an eternal being. But he says, so on the one hand, God is different. So, we just can't choose anything if God is different, right? He's holy and he's a creator. Right? But on the other hand, he says that we can, in some sense, choose God from among other things. How's that so? Well, he says this is pretty plain. After all, we often don't value what God values. We frequently find meaning where he finds little or none, right? And the footnote here is interesting, and so I want to read this here. He says, of course, the term find is dangerous because it can be misleading in precisely the way I've been guarding against. There aren't meanings out there. Again, that's his point, to be found. So maybe a better way to put it is to replace we find meaning with we value. In that case, we would say instead that we sometimes value things that God doesn't value. Right? So
so for the atheist that finds value in feeding their cat, there's no finding value in feeding the cat. It's that's the value that they subscribe to themselves, so that they can get on with their life. So it's not a I found it. Here's the answer. It's this is what I'm taking as my ultimate standard of value.
And so, here's his, he says we can, choose to align with God or not. But the point is this: the cosmos is profoundly personal. It's a place where the highest value turns out to be a place placed on relationships, right? That's what the highest value is. God calls us to a relationship of mutual love. In fact, God himself is a relationship among persons, according to the doctrine of the Trinity.
Right.
And it's only in the proper relation to these persons that we find value and meaning that are ultimately satisfying. Now, he says that, he's not presenting an argument here, right? He's merely explaining how Christians can make sense of the view that all value and meanings are subjective or personal or person-dependent. So, of course, he says, if what I say here is right, then there's also a sense in which there's objective value in the human independent sense, namely God's values. So, again, he makes the point that objectivity is different than the subjective relative value that we individually have, or even collectively, right? It has to do with God's value. And
Right.
that's what makes it human. It's what makes it objective, because it's human independent, right? It's kind of like, and I think we've probably, talked about this illustration before, right? The tallest mountain above sea level in the world is Mount Everest. Now, notice it's that regardless of what I believe, regardless of my opinions, regardless of what I think, it is objectively independent of my beliefs and judgments and opinions. The tallest mountain above sea level. Well, that's the kind of point. So that's the idea of objectivity. It's independent of human, thinking and belief and that sort of thing. And he's saying here, values are ultimate values anyway. Objective values then have to be centered in something other than our beliefs, our opinions, or just what we value, right? Otherwise, it is just subjective, and it is, it isn't objective, and therefore, it's kind of like, okay, I have to remember to feed the cat well.
Yeah, I don't want to remember. to feed the cat.
That is not an objective value. That's a subjective value, and what good is it? All right, God makes objective value because they are human independent, because they're what God values. All right. He says, and here we come to the point of why I've jumped up and down on the fact that value is ultimately personal. We theists typically argue that our view makes sense of objective moral and natural laws. Now, he thinks this is a mistake, right? We say, what makes sense of moral laws is that, the idea that they're objective, that they're independent, right? He says, but this is a mistake. To be sure, I think a theist view of the cosmos makes better sense of our world, and the Christian view does this best of all. But as long as we continue to argue for objective values and laws in the full-blooded person-independent and therefore God-independent sense of objective, we naturally give the impression that there are such things. But there aren't. The universe in and of itself doesn't have any of these things, right? You have to have a person, right? And for it to be, objective and valuable, right? He says, so we unintentionally perpetuate the lie that there is an impersonal view of the universe. What Nagel said, a view from nowhere. This lie, he says, has kept the Enlightenment project alive, and is why the atheists like Harris continue to search for an impersonal ground of moral value. But there can be no such thing as an impersonal ground, a naturalistic ground for moral value. His point is, because values are personal,
right.
You have to have a person. And if you want ultimate value, you have to have an ultimate person, right? And he says, what we cherish most is personal and indeed relational. And as the old hymn puts it, this is my Father's world, right? And then we turn the page and there's nothing else left.
Right.
So that's how he ends this particular chapter.
Right.